The rats came first. This is not entirely accurate as a matter of the disease's epidemiology, but it is how the medieval world would have understood it, and the medieval world's understanding is where I want to begin. The rats came first, and then the fleas that fed on the rats, and then the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, a name that could not have meant anything to anyone in 1347, and that would not acquire its meaning for another 5 centuries, until Alexandre Yersin identified the organism responsible in 1894. In 1347, what came was something that had no accurate name yet, that was described in terms of divine punishment and corrupted air and the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius that the astrologers of Paris had identified as the celestial cause of the pestilence in the year of our Lord, 1345. The bacterium, when it finally received its name, was found to be one of the most ancient pathogens ever identified in ancient human remains. Older than the civilization of Greece, possibly older than the civilization of Egypt, a killer of human beings that predated the Black Death by thousands of years and that appeared in the archaeological record of Eurasian populations going back to the late Neolithic. The specific form of the plague that arrived in Europe in 1347 was not a new disease encountering a new population. It was an ancient disease arriving at a particularly vulnerable population at a particularly vulnerable moment, with particular efficiency and with consequences that neither the population nor its physicians nor its religious institutions were remotely equipped to manage. A ship arrived in the harbour of Messina, in Sicily, in October of 1347. Genoese trading ships coming from the ports of the Black Sea. The harbour authorities went aboard and found most of the crew dead. The survivors were covered in black swellings, buboes, from the Greek for groin, where the lymph nodes concentrating the infection were most visible. On the neck, the armpits, the groin, black and swollen and oozing blood and pus, the characteristic presentation of bubonic plague at its most severe. The harbour masters ordered the ships out of the port. It was already too late. By the time the ships left Messina, the disease had come ashore. It spread through Messina and through Sicily in the winter of 1347 to 1348. By the spring of 1348 it was in mainland Italy. By the summer it was in France and Spain. By the end of 1348 it was in England and Germany. By 1350 it had reached Scandinavia and Poland and Russia. The specific speed of the plague's movement across Europe, roughly a kilometre per day in some estimates, following the roads and the trade routes and the river valleys, is one of the most remarkable facts about it, and it tells us something specific about the interconnected world of the 14th century, a world whose roads and rivers and harbours were capable of distributing death at that rate, the mortality. It is very difficult to write about the Black Death's mortality without the numbers becoming numbing. 1/3 of the population of Europe, perhaps half. The estimates vary because the 14th century sources are neither comprehensive nor reliable in the specific statistical sense, and because the definition of Europe in this context is doing some work, and because the mortality was very uneven. Some communities lost fewer than 1 in 10, some lost more than half, and the specific reasons for these differences are not always clear. The broad estimate that historians currently consider most defensible is that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe died of the plague between 1347 and 1353, with subsequent waves of the plague recurring at roughly 10 to 20 year intervals for the next century. What does a number like that mean? I want to try to make it real rather than numbing, to give it the specific human weight that the numbers scale works against. Take a village of 200 people, a typical English or French or Italian village of the mid-14th century. Not a large settlement, perhaps 40 or 50 houses, a church, a mill, a blacksmith's shop, fields that the community farms in the strip system that characterized medieval European agriculture. In this village, everyone knows everyone. The blacksmith knows the names of every horse he has shod. The priest has baptized every child, married every couple, buried every elder. The miller knows whose grain is whose. The women who wash the linens in the village stream know each other's troubles. 200 people, in constant, intimate, unavoidable contact with each other for their entire lives. Now remove 60 to 100 of them. Choose them, or rather, do not choose them, because the plague chose them by mechanisms that no one in the 14th century understood, apparently at random, with a specific preference for the young and the old, but not sparing the middle-aged, killing one member of a family, and leaving another untouched, taking a healthy man and leaving the invalid, respecting no social hierarchy. 60 to 100 people, chosen randomly from 200, gone in a matter of weeks. The people who remain know who is missing. They do not know in the abstract statistical way in which we might calculate a mortality rate. They know specifically that house is empty now, the family that lived in it is gone, that field is unplanted because the man who ploughed it died in August. The mill is silent because the miller died and his apprentice died, and no one has yet been found to run it. The church bells ring constantly for the dead, and then fall silent because the bell ringer is dead and no one can be found to ring them. The plague did not produce abstract statistics for the people who survived it. It produced a landscape of specific absences, each one a name, a face, a voice, a set of specific relationships and obligations and memories that had organized the survivors' world. This is where I want to take you. Not to the great mortality as a historical phenomenon, though I will give you the historical phenomenon, but to the specific experience of the people who lived through it, who survived it, which most people did, because a mortality rate of 1 in 3 or 1 in 2, however catastrophic, is also a survival rate of 1 in 2 or 2 in 3. Most people who encountered the Black Death did not die of it. They lived with it, through it, and after it. And the world they lived in after was not the world they had lived in before. Let me give you the autumn of 1347, before the plague arrived, to give you what was lost. The Europe of the mid-14th century was not the Europe of the early medieval period. It had recovered from the social and political disruptions of the early medieval centuries, had developed in the high medieval period from roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, a relatively stable agricultural society organized around the manorial system, a church that provided the intellectual and spiritual framework for almost every aspect of life, a slowly developing commercial economy centered on the Italian city-states and the trading networks of the Hanseatic League and the Champagne fairs. The population had been growing for 3 centuries, from perhaps 30 million in 1000 CE to perhaps 75 or 80 million in 1300. This growth had pushed cultivation onto marginal land, had increased urbanization, had made the cities of Italy and Flanders significant commercial centers, but by 1300 the growth was stalling. The marginal lands were producing poorly. The climate was cooling. The medieval warm period that had enabled the expansion of cultivation into northern Europe and the Scandinavian settlements in Greenland was ending, replaced by the Little Ice Age that would characterize the next several centuries. The harvests of 1315 to 1322 failed catastrophically across northern Europe. The Great Famine, which killed perhaps 10 to 15% of the population of northern Europe in those 7 years, and which weakened the surviving population and left them more vulnerable to what was coming. By the time the plague ships arrived in Messina in October 1347, Europe was already a continent under stress, overpopulated relative to its food supply, recently weakened by famine, governed by a church whose authority was fraying at the edges, organized by a social system that was experiencing specific tensions between the feudal lords and the emerging commercial class. The plague found this weakened, stressed, interconnected continent and moved through it with the efficiency of a fire through dry wood. Guy de Chauliac was the physician to Pope Clement VI at Avignon, and he left one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the plague's appearance and course. He survived the plague himself, or rather, he contracted it and recovered, which was unusual and which he attributed to his own careful isolation during the worst of the epidemic, remaining in his room and surrounded by large fires that he believed purified the air. He describes 2 distinct forms of the disease: the bubonic form, with the characteristic swellings which he says typically lasted about 5 days and killed most of its victims, and the pneumonic form, which affected the lungs and produced blood spitting and virtually certain death within 2 to 3 days. He was correct in this distinction. Bubonic plague and pneumonic plague are 2 different clinical presentations of Yersinia pestis infection, the pneumonic form being direct infection of the lungs, usually through respiratory transmission, and being indeed more quickly and almost universally fatal. What Guy de Chauliac could not tell his readers, because he did not know, was the bacterium, the flea, the rat, the specific mechanism by which the disease moved from person to person. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was built on 2 primary theories: miasma, the idea that corrupted air emanating from rotting organic matter, from swamps, from the bodies of the dead, caused disease by corrupting the air that the patient breathed, and contagion, the idea that the disease was transmitted by contact with the sick or with their belongings. Both theories were partly right and partly wrong. The miasma theory was right, that infectious disease is associated with unhygienic conditions, but wrong about the mechanism. The contagion theory was right, that direct contact with the infected could spread the disease, but missed the role of the flea as the primary vector. The specific failure of the medieval medical tradition to understand what was happening in 1347 and 1348 had direct consequences. If you do not know that rat fleas are transmitting the disease, you do not know to kill rats and to avoid flea bites. If you believe that miasma is the cause, you respond by burning aromatic woods and carrying posies of flowers and lighting large fires in the streets, all of which do nothing to prevent infection, and some of which, by concentrating people, may have made it worse. If you believe that the disease is God's punishment for human sin, you respond by prayer and penitence, and the public flagellant processions that became one of the most vivid expressions of the plague's impact on European religious practice. The flagellants. They appeared in Germany in the summer of 1348 and spread rapidly through Central and Northern Europe. Groups of men, sometimes several hundred strong, who walked from city to city, performing public acts of extreme penitence. The ceremonies were elaborate and specific. The flagellants would gather in a public space. The master would read a letter that claimed divine authorization for the movement, and then the men would strip to the waist and beat themselves with iron-tipped leather thongs until they bled, while chanting hymns and singing penitential songs. The performance lasted for about half an hour and was witnessed by large crowds who sometimes joined the procession. The flagellant movement was, in a specific sense, a rational response to an irrational situation. If God was punishing Europe for its sins, which was the most theologically coherent explanation available for what was happening, then the appropriate response was the most extreme possible penitence, the giving of pain in expiation for the guilt that had caused the punishment. The flagellants were taking seriously the logic of the interpretation that the Church provided for the disaster, pushing it to its furthest extreme. The problem was that this logic, in the hands of groups that were moving outside institutional Church control, rapidly became anti-institutional and anti-clerical in ways that the Church found alarming. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement in October 1349, and the secular authorities, responding to pressure from the papacy, suppressed it. But the movement had demonstrated something important. In a situation of sufficient extremity, people would go outside the institutional frameworks that normally governed their religious expression. The Jews. The Black Death produced one of the most catastrophic episodes of anti-Jewish violence in the medieval period. The massacres of Jewish communities across the Rhine Valley and beyond, motivated by the accusation that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning the wells. The accusation was absurd on its face and was not supported by any evidence, but it was plausible to many people in 1348 and 1349 because it provided a human explanation for a catastrophe that otherwise seemed inexplicable, and because the existing traditions of anti-Jewish prejudice in European culture provided a ready template for the accusation. If someone had poisoned the wells, it would have to be the people who were most different, most mistrusted, most outside the community. The massacres were also partly driven by the observation, which had a kernel of truth, though not the truth the perpetrators thought, that Jewish communities in some areas seemed to be dying at lower rates than the Christian population. This was probably due not to any special immunity or any special complicity, but to specific practices. Jewish dietary laws required the ritual slaughter of animals rather than the consumption of rats and other disease-carrying animals that might have been more common in the diets of the poorest Christians. Jewish ritual washing practices may have reduced some exposure vectors. The relative isolation of Jewish communities from some of the worst overcrowding of the urban poor may have reduced some exposure, but in the specific cognitive environment of 1348, lower Jewish mortality looked like evidence of either divine protection or complicity with the disease. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 defending the Jews, pointing out that they were dying of the plague in the same regions where they were accused of causing it, and commanding that Christians stop persecuting them. The papal authority was insufficient to stop the massacres, which continued through 1349 and 1350. Thousands of Jews were killed across Germany and the Low Countries and Switzerland and France. entire communities were destroyed. The demographic and social geography of Jewish life in Europe was permanently altered by the plague massacres, with many communities expelled to Poland and Lithuania and beyond, where the center of European Jewish life would remain for the following centuries. The specific human experience of the plague. I want to give you some of the individual accounts that have survived, because the great mortality becomes comprehensible in a different way when it is experienced through specific people rather than through aggregate statistics. Agnolo di Tura was a chronicler in Siena who wrote about the plague in 1348 with a specificity that suggests personal witness. He describes the disease, the swellings under the arms and in the groin, the fever, the rapid death, and then he writes, "And no one weeps for the dead, because all expect death. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands." He goes on to describe the bodies piled in the streets, the mass graves, the dogs eating the abandoned dead. "And I can say," he writes, "what I cannot bear to remember." Boccaccio, who was in Florence during the plague of 1348 and who used his experience as the framing device for the Decameron, describes the social dissolution that the plague produced in Florence. He describes people abandoning their sick relatives, running from the city, refusing to care for the dying out of fear of their own death. He describes the complete breakdown of normal social conventions, the abandonment of the funeral ceremonies that had marked the transition from life to death, the bodies simply carried out and thrown in a ditch, sometimes dozens to a grave, covered with a thin layer of soil, the crosses that mark the graves fewer than the dead they covered. He is not entirely a reliable witness. The Decameron is literature, not history, and Boccaccio's plague description serves literary purposes. But the details he provides are consistent with other accounts of the period. Petrarch lost his beloved Laura to the plague in 1348. Laura, the woman whose identity remains debated by scholars, the subject of hundreds of sonnets that constitute one of the great monuments of Italian Renaissance poetry, died in Avignon on April 6, 1348, 21 years after the date that Petrarch had marked as the beginning of his love for her. Petrarch survived her, and the loss transformed his work. The poems he wrote after her death are suffused with a specific kind of grief, not the conventional literary grief of the courtly love tradition, but something rawer and more personal. The grief of a man who has watched the world change around him and who cannot make the change mean anything. The specific year 1348 is, in Petrarch's correspondence, the year everything changed. He writes to a friend in 1349, looking back at what had just happened. "We cannot deny that our fathers were more fortunate than us, or perhaps it should be said that they were unhappier, but escaped the knowledge of our unhappiness, since they left us this world and now rest from its toils, and the sight of our misery is hidden from them. Now," he writes, "our hopes are shattered, and our plans are confused, and we are left alone to pick up the pieces of the world that was." Let me give you the plague in the countryside, because most people in the 14th century were not in cities. Most people lived in the small rural communities that constituted the overwhelming majority of the medieval population, and the plague in the countryside had a specific character that was somewhat different from the plague in the city. In the city, the density of population meant that the disease spread faster and that the death toll was more immediately visible. The bodies in the streets that Agnolo di Tura described, the mass graves that the grave diggers could not fill fast enough. In the countryside, the disease moved more slowly, following the roads and the rivers, reaching each community in turn, spending a few terrible weeks, and then moving on. The mortality in rural communities was generally somewhat lower than in cities, possibly because the population density was lower, but it was still catastrophic by any pre-plague standard. What the rural plague left behind was empty land. When a family died, the husband, the wife, the children, the house stood empty. The field that the family had farmed as tenants on the manorial estate was unplanted. The livestock wandered without care. The debt that the family had owed to the Lord was extinguished because there was no one to collect it from. The specific labour arrangement that had organised the rural economy, the villain's obligation to work the Lord's demesne in exchange for the use of land and the Lord's protection, was disrupted at a fundamental level because the labour that made it function was gone. The Lord of the manor faced a specific problem that would transform the rural economy of Europe over the following century. He could not find people to work his land at the old prices because the people who had been doing the work were dead, and the people who remained alive could demand higher wages or better terms because there was more land than there were people to work it. The labour economics of post-plague Europe were transformed by the simple arithmetic of the mortality. When you kill a third to a half of the labour force, the value of labour increases. The serf who survived 1348 was worth more to the lord than the serf who had died, because the surviving serf was now one of a smaller pool of workers competing for their labour among a larger pool of available employers. The peasants understood this. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France in 1358, the uprisings that swept through the Italian cities and the German territories in the decades after the plague. All of these were expressions of the specific awareness that the survivors of the Black Death had acquired, the awareness that the old social arrangement was no longer the only possible arrangement, that the lords needed them more than they needed to acknowledge. The plague did not cause the peasant revolts. They had other, complicated immediate causes, but the plague created the conditions in which the revolts became possible, by demonstrating to the peasants that the social order was not natural and permanent, but was constructed and contingent, that it could be disrupted and might be disrupted. The Church, the institution that was most immediately and most fundamentally challenged by the Black Death, was the Church. And the challenge came from multiple directions simultaneously. The first challenge was the mortality itself. The clergy died at roughly the same rate as the rest of the population, and in some areas probably at higher rates, because the specific duties of the priestly office, hearing confession, administering last rites, visiting the sick, burying the dead, required close contact with the dying in ways that other occupations did not. The experienced, trained clergy of 1347 was significantly depleted by the plague of 1347 to 1349, and the replacement clergy ordained to fill the gap were often younger, less educated, and less experienced than the men they replaced. The specific human capital of the medieval church, the accumulated learning and the accumulated practice of generations of priests and monks and scholars, was partly destroyed by the plague and imperfectly replaced. The second challenge was theological. If God had sent this catastrophe, and the Church taught that nothing happened outside God's will, why had He sent it? The standard theological responses were available. God was punishing humanity for its sins. God was testing the faithful. God was calling the righteous to heaven. But these responses became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of the plague's evident randomness. The pious and the impious died at similar rates. Children died, infants died. The plague was not a visible punishment of the wicked. It was, from the perspective of the survivors, a massive and apparently random death that spared some and took others for no discernible reason. The third challenge was institutional authority. The Church's authority in the medieval world rested partly on its claim to provide the specific services, the sacraments, that were necessary for salvation. The dying needed confession and last rites. The dead needed proper burial in consecrated ground. When the clergy were dying themselves, and when the rate of death was too high for the sacramental system to function normally, when the priests were overwhelmed, when the graveyards were full, when the bodies were being buried in mass graves without last rites because there was no time, the sacramental system began to fail in ways that the Church acknowledged by extraordinary dispensations, allowing lay people to hear confession, allowing burial in unconsecrated ground, relaxing the normal requirements. These dispensations acknowledged the system's failure, and in acknowledging it, they raised questions about whether the system's normal functioning was as essential as the Church had claimed. What came after? The Black Death ended, in the sense that the initial pandemic wave ended around 1352 or 1353, though the plague would return in subsequent waves throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, with particular virulence in 1361 and 1369 and at various later dates. The Europe that emerged from the initial catastrophe was different in specific ways that the scholarship of the past century has worked to understand and articulate. The labour economics changed, as I have described, in ways that benefited the surviving peasants and damaged the feudal lords. The wages of labour rose, the price of land fell, the specific bargain of the manorial system, the peasants' labour in exchange for the lord's land and protection, was renegotiated, slowly and often violently, in the direction of greater peasant freedom and greater peasant economic power. The villeinage, the servile status of the medieval peasant, began to decline in Western Europe in the decades after the plague, not primarily because of moral conviction, but because the labor economics made it difficult to maintain. The artistic tradition changed. The specific image of the danse macabre, the dance of death, in which the figure of death leads representatives of all social classes in a procession toward the grave, emerged in the years after the Black Death and became one of the defining images of late medieval art. The image is not merely morbid, it is democratic. Death takes the Pope and the Emperor and the priest and the peasant and the merchant with equal indifference. The social hierarchy that organized every other aspect of medieval life is dissolved by death, which takes them all in the same order: you are next. This is a genuinely new emphasis in European artistic and cultural life, not the absence of mortality, which had always been present in Christian iconography, but the specific insistence on the equality of mortality as a refutation of all earthly hierarchy. The theology changed. The specific character of later medieval piety, its more personal relationship with Christ and the Virgin Mary, its emphasis on the individual's direct encounter with the divine, rather than the mediated relationship that the institutional church provided, its interest in mystical experience, its fascination with the suffering of Christ's body and the body of the Virgin. All of these developments were not caused by the Black Death, but they were accelerated by it. The plague had demonstrated, in the most brutal possible way, the inadequacy of institutional religion as a response to catastrophe, and the personal, experiential, mystical direction that late medieval piety took was partly a response to that inadequacy. The demographic change. The population of Europe did not recover to its pre-plague level until roughly 1500, a century and a half of below-peak population, with the recurrence of the plague at regular intervals preventing sustained recovery. This prolonged demographic depression had specific consequences for European society and culture that the scholarship is still working to fully articulate. The labour shortage that benefited the peasants was one. The consolidation of landholding as the peasantry contracted and the lords absorbed abandoned holdings was another. The specific cultural effects of a society that had been catastrophically reduced in population and that was living with the knowledge that the plague might return at any time. That is a harder thing to quantify, but it is visible in the specific character of late medieval culture, in the memento mori tradition, in the elaborate funerary practices, in the specific anxiety about death that runs through the literature and the art of the period. The medical response. The plague did not immediately produce anything we would recognize as effective public health measures, but it did produce the beginnings of institutional responses to epidemic disease that were genuinely new. The city of Venice established the first quarantine system in 1377, requiring ships from plague-infected ports to anchor offshore for 40 days, quarantino journey in Italian, which gives us the word quarantine, before being permitted to unload their cargo and their passengers. The specific innovation of quarantine was the acknowledgement that contagion was a mechanism of disease transmission and that isolation could prevent it. It was not understood in the terms of germ theory, but it was effective in the terms of epidemic control, and it established the principle of isolation as a public health tool that has been used against epidemic disease ever since. Other cities established health boards, permanent committees tasked with monitoring the health of the population and responding to outbreaks. They kept records, they tracked the disease. They began, gradually and imperfectly, the development of the public health infrastructure that would eventually, centuries later, become capable of actually controlling epidemic disease. The Black Death was not immediately productive of effective medicine. The Yersinia pestis bacterium would not be identified for 5 centuries, and the antibiotics that can cure bubonic plague in its early stages, in hours, would not exist for 6 centuries. But it produced the institutional responses that were the beginning of epidemiology, the science of the distribution and control of disease in populations, the survivors. I want to end with the survivors, because the plague's legacy is not only death, it is also, and perhaps more importantly, the specific experience of surviving. The people who lived through the Black Death did not simply return to normal life when the plague passed. They lived in the world that the plague had made, the world of the specific absences, the empty houses and the unplanted fields, and the colleagues who were not there, and the children who had not survived, and the spouse who had died while they lived. Some of them were marked by what had happened in ways that are visible in their writing and their art. The specific character of late medieval memoir, the frequent meditation on mortality, the specific quality of attention to the present moment, the awareness that the world is fragile, is partly the legacy of the plague experience. Petrarch's later work has this quality. Boccaccio's Decameron has this quality, in its framing at least. The 10 young people who tell their stories have fled Florence to escape the plague, and they are telling their stories in a kind of deliberate, life-affirming opposition to the death they have left behind them in the city. The Decameron is, in a specific sense, the survivor's project. It is 100 stories told by people who have survived something that killed many of their neighbors, told in the specific act of refusing to let the catastrophe be the last word. The stories are not all serious. They are, famously, often bawdy, often comic, often irreverent toward the church and the social conventions that the Black Death had disrupted. This irreverence is not nihilism. It is the specific response of people who have seen the social order collapse and who have discovered that the collapse did not produce nothing, that life continued, that human beings continued, that the particular pleasures and the particular absurdities of human life continued even in the shadow of the worst catastrophe that Europe had experienced since the fall of Rome. The world changed after the Black Death. It changed in the ways I have described, in labour economics and in church authority, and in artistic sensibility and in demographic reality, but it changed in a deeper way as well, a way that is harder to quantify and easier to feel. The world that came after was a world that knew it could be catastrophically disrupted. That knowledge had not been available before 1347, not in the specific, embodied personal way that the survivors of the plague possessed it. The survivors knew that the world was fragile in a way that their parents and grandparents had not known, not as individuals, rather than as abstract theological possibility. What they did with that knowledge is, in some ways, the story of the Renaissance. The specific flowering of European culture in the 15th and 16th centuries, the art and the architecture, and the philosophy and the science, was not caused by the Black Death, but it grew in the specific soil that the Black Death had created. The soil of a world that had been catastrophically disrupted, that had been forced to question its assumptions, that had discovered that the old arrangements were neither permanent nor necessary. The people who built the Renaissance were not primarily the survivors of the plague. They were, mostly, a generation or two removed from the worst of it. But they were the inheritors of a world that the plague had unmade and remade. A world that was, in specific ways, more open to making things new. Agnolo di Tura buried his 5 children with his own hands, and then, because there was nothing else to do, he continued. He lived, and he wrote about what he had seen, and he passed the account on to whoever would read it. He did not know that what he was passing on would be read centuries later. He knew only that it had happened, and that someone should know about it, and that someone should say, "We were here, and this happened to us, and we survived it, and this is what it was like." This is what the survivors always do. They continue. They bury their dead with their own hands, or they cannot because there are too many, and then they continue anyway. The world that was gone is gone. The world that remains requires inhabiting. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me slow down and give specific places their proper texture, because the Black Death was not experienced as a statistical event in the abstract. It was experienced as a specific event in a specific place by specific people, and the place mattered. The geography shaped the experience, the local social structures shaped the response, the local religious culture shaped the meaning that people imposed on what was happening. Florence in the spring and summer of 1348. The city of perhaps 80 to 90,000 people before the plague, one of the largest cities in Europe at the time, a centre of the wool trade and the banking industry, the city of Dante, who had died in 1321, and of Giotto, who had died in 1337, both of them gone before the plague, became the city of the plague in the spring of 1348. And what happened there was witnessed by Boccaccio with enough proximity and detail that his description in the introduction to the Decameron remains one of the most vivid accounts of the plague anywhere in the literature. Boccaccio describes the onset of the symptoms, the swellings in the groin and armpit, the black or livid blotches on the arms and thighs, the fever, the rapid progression to death. He describes the speed of transmission, that not only the infected, but people who merely spoke to them or touched their clothes could contract the disease. He describes the failure of the city's normal social responses, the abandonment of the sick by their neighbours and sometimes by their families, the flight of the wealthy to their country estates, the collapse of the funeral practices that had organized the community's relationship to death. He describes the bodies piled in the street, the mass graves, the casual way in which people who had died at night were discovered in the morning by their neighbors. And then he describes something that strikes me as the most significant detail in his account, the one that captures most precisely what the plague did to the social fabric of Florence. The wealthy and the middling sort, he says, shut themselves in their houses. They ate and drank and were moderate in their living, and kept away from all excess, and they spoke to no one, and they refused to receive any news of the sick and the dead from outside. Others, he says, took the opposite view, to drink freely and to enjoy life to the full, to go from place to place seeking pleasures, to satisfy every appetite. And others, he says, walked through the streets singing songs and carrying flowers and doing whatever they could to drive out their grief. And the church was not preaching, and the laws were silent, and each person did as they thought best. This is what a catastrophe of sufficient scale does to a society's normative framework. It suspends it. The normal rules about how to treat the dying, about how to bury the dead, about how to conduct oneself in public, about how to maintain the specific social performances that hold a community together, become optional when the catastrophe is large enough and fast enough. Not everyone abandons the rules. Many people continue to try to care for the sick, continue to try to maintain the funeral rites, continue to try to conduct themselves as they thought was right. But the rules themselves lost their compulsory character because the enforcement mechanisms, social disapproval, religious authority, legal consequence, were themselves suspended by the catastrophe. The countryside around Florence, the rural Tuscany that surrounded Florence in 1348, was the specific landscape of the mezzadria, the sharecropping system in which the peasant worked the land in exchange for a share of the harvest, typically half paid to the landowner, who provided the tools and the seed and the animals and the direction. The mezzadria had been developing for several generations, and it represented a specific form of the relationship between the rural labourer and the urban capital that owned the land. More flexible than Northern European villeinage, more commercially oriented, reflecting the specific character of the Florentine economy in which the city's commercial wealth was being invested in the surrounding countryside. When the plague hit the rural Tuscany, the specific consequence was the disruption of the mezzadria relationship. The peasants died, the livestock died, unattended or wandered away. The tools were left in the fields. The contracts that had organized the land tenure were in many cases unenforceable because the contracting parties were dead. The Florentine merchant who owned a farm in the Mugello might discover, when the plague had passed, that the family he had trusted to work the land was entirely gone, that the tools had been stolen or had rusted, that the land itself was reverting to scrub. The specific documentation of this process survives in the archives of Florentine merchant houses, the account books and the correspondence that the Florentine commercial tradition kept in extraordinary detail. Reading these documents, you can see the specific arithmetic of the plague's economic consequences. Farms that had been generating income in 1346 are listed as vacant in 1349. Their income entries replaced by the single word abandoned or the tenants have died. Properties that the merchant had planned to develop are left undeveloped because there are no workers to hire, or because the workers who survived are demanding wages that the merchant cannot afford to pay. England in the autumn and winter of 1348 to 1349. The plague arrived in England in August of 1348, carried ashore at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, though the exact port of entry is debated, and moved eastward and northward through the autumn and winter. The English sources for the plague are extensive and include not only the chronicle accounts of monks and chroniclers, but also the ecclesiastical records, the registrations of deaths of clergy, the licenses given to replacement clergy, the wills that were probated, that give us a relatively detailed picture of the plague's progress through specific communities. The records of the Bishop of Bath and Wells in Somerset are particularly detailed. The bishop, Ralph of Shrewsbury, issued a series of letters in January 1349 that are among the most revealing documents of the English plague. He wrote to all the parish priests of his diocese, instructing them that in the extreme necessity of the current epidemic, if a dying person could not obtain a priest for confession, they should make their confession to any lay person, male or female, and if no lay person was available, then to God. He acknowledged that the existing rules about who could hear confession were being suspended by the emergency. He was trying to ensure that the dying received at least the spiritual preparation for death that the Church taught was necessary for salvation, even if the institutional form of that preparation was unavailable. The same letters acknowledge that in some parishes there was no priest, not temporarily, not because the priest was ill, but because the priest was dead and no replacement had yet been found, and no replacement could be found quickly because the pool of available replacement clergy was itself being depleted by the plague. The specific institutional crisis of the English Church in 1349 is visible in these letters. An institution that had always had more clergy than it needed, suddenly desperately short of clergy, forced to improvise and to bend its own rules, acknowledging the emergency by the very act of setting aside the normal procedures. The village of Ayam. I am going to leap forward 2.5 centuries from the Black Death to the plague that struck the Derbyshire village of Ayam in 1665 and 1666, because Ayam provides one of the clearest and most fully documented examples of what a plague community looks like from the inside, and because the story of Ayam speaks directly to something that I think is at the heart of the plague's human legacy. In September 1665, a parcel of cloth arrived in Ayam from London, where the plague was raging. The tailor who received the parcel, George Vickers, opened it and found it damp. He hung it up to dry. He was dead of the plague within a week. The plague moved through Ayam through the autumn and winter and into the spring, and by the early months of 1666 the village was clearly experiencing a serious epidemic. The rector of Ayam, William Mompesson, made a decision that has become one of the defining acts of moral courage in the history of epidemic disease. He called the village together and proposed that they quarantine themselves, that they agree not to leave the village so that the plague would not spread to the surrounding communities. He persuaded them. For 14 months, from the spring of 1666 to the end of 1666, the village of Ayam sealed itself off from the world. Neighbours left food and supplies at the village boundaries. The villagers paid for what they took, leaving coins in water or vinegar to disinfect them. They stayed. When it was over, 260 of Ayam's approximately 350 inhabitants were dead. William Mompesson survived. His wife Catherine did not. He buried her himself in the field outside the village because the churchyard was full. The story of Ayam is not directly about the Black Death, but it illuminates something that the Black Death survivors also lived with: the specific experience of the people who chose to face the plague rather than flee from it, who understood that running away was possible, but who understood also what running away would cost the people they left behind. Mompesson's quarantine was not merely a public health measure, though it was that. It was a specific moral choice about what the community owed to the world outside it. The choice to contain the damage by accepting more damage, to sacrifice the possibility of escape in order to protect others who had no choice about their exposure. I do not know how many people in 1348 made the equivalent choice. The literature mostly records the flight, the wealthy leaving Florence, the clergy abandoning their parishes, the officials fleeing the cities before the plague arrived. But the people who stayed and cared for the dying are in the record too, even if they are less visible. The women who nursed the sick when the men had fled, the monks in the monasteries who continued their rounds of prayer and care until they died, the village priests who heard confession after confession knowing that the next confession might be their own. The theology of mercy. There is a specific tension at the heart of the medieval Christian response to the Black Death, and I want to name it because it shaped the experience of the plague in ways that were not always visible to contemporaries. The Church taught that the plague was God's punishment. It taught simultaneously that Christians were obligated to care for the sick and the dying. The specific obligation of mercy, the corporal works of mercy that included visiting the sick and burying the dead. These two teachings pointed in different directions when the plague arrived. If the plague was God's punishment, then perhaps the prudent response was to distance oneself from the punished and to trust in God's mercy for one's own safety. But if the works of mercy were obligatory, then the dying person in front of you demanded your attention regardless of the risk. The resolution that many people reached, both clergy and lay people, was a kind of deliberate self-exposure, the acceptance of the risk of caring for the dying as a form of the specifically Christian martyrdom, the willingness to die in service of another as the supreme expression of Christian love. This is not the resolution of a timid theology. It is the resolution of a theology that took both God's judgment and God's mercy seriously and found in the tension between them a call to action rather than paralysis, the specific problem of meaning. I want to return to this because it is what the plague did to European culture at the deepest level. Not the deaths. The deaths were the immediate catastrophe, but what the deaths meant, that is where the long-term transformation happened. The medieval world had a very specific understanding of what death meant, and it was not a comfortable understanding for a modern sensibility, but it was comprehensive and it was coherent. Death was the transition from this life to the life to come, the specific form of that transition, the state of the soul at the moment of death, the particular judgment, the possibility of purgatory, the specific nature of heaven and hell, was elaborately and systematically worked out in medieval theology. The rituals that surrounded death, the last rites, the prayers for the dead, the masses offered for the souls of the departed, the specific mechanism of indulgences that could reduce the time a soul spent in purgatory, were not merely emotional support, they were the practical operations of a system that, if it worked correctly, ensured the soul's proper transition and ultimate salvation. The plague disrupted this system at every point. The dying could not receive last rites because the priests were dead or unavailable. The bodies could not be properly buried because the graveyards were full and the gravediggers were dead. The masses for the souls of the dead could not be offered because the priests to say them were not there. The indulgences could not be obtained because the church's administrative apparatus was overwhelmed. If the system did not work, if the dying were dying without last rites, if the dead were being buried in mass graves without prayers, if the accumulated spiritual capital that medieval theology told people was necessary for salvation was simply not available, then what was happening to the souls of those who died in this catastrophe? Were they damned? Were they saved despite the absence of the sacramental preparation? Was the system that the church had taught was essential actually essential? These questions were not asked primarily by the educated and the theologically trained, though they were asked by them too. They were asked by ordinary people, people who had learnt the system and trusted the system, and who were now watching the system fail to function in the situation in which they most needed it. The answers that the church provided, that God's mercy was greater than the system, that the faithful who died without rites were not necessarily damned, that the extraordinary circumstances of the plague were understood by God, were pastorally comforting but theologically undermining. They implied that the system was not as essential as the church had taught, that God was not bound by the sacramental structure in ways that the church's authority claimed, that the individual's relationship with God might be more direct and less mediated than the church's institutional claim implied. This implication, once felt, could not be unexperienced. It was one of the specific paths that led, over the following century and a half, to the Reformation, to the specific moment when Martin Luther's challenge to the church's authority over salvation crystallized into a permanent split in Western Christianity. The Reformation was not caused by the Black Death, but the Black Death created, in the specific experience of the survivors, the emotional and theological ground in which the Reformation's seeds could eventually grow. The specific resilience. I have been giving you loss and disruption and theological crisis, and these are real. But I want to give you also the specific human resilience that the plague produced in its survivors. Because the history of the 14th century is not only a history of death, but also a history of people who kept going in the face of death. Christine de Pizan was born in Venice in 1364, 16 years after the Black Death's initial wave, and grew up in Paris, where her father was court astrologer to the French King Charles V. She married at 15, was widowed at 25 with 3 children to support, and responded to her situation by doing something that was genuinely unusual for a woman of the 14th century. She became a professional writer. She wrote poetry and prose in both French and Italian. She wrote a defense of women's dignity and intelligence that is one of the earliest works of feminist argument in European letters. She wrote a biography of Charles V. She wrote political and moral philosophy. She was, by any standard, one of the most remarkable intellectuals of her period. Christine de Pizan's work was not primarily about the plague. She was born after the worst of it, and her specific situation was shaped by other circumstances. But she is a figure of the post-plague world, a woman who succeeded in doing something that the pre-plague world would have made even harder than the post-plague world made it, because the specific disruptions of the plague period had opened certain things that had been more firmly closed before. The plague had demonstrated the contingency of social arrangements. The economic disruptions it had produced had created new opportunities for some people, particularly in the towns and cities where the labour shortage and the redistribution of wealth had produced a new class of small proprietors and skilled craftspeople. The specific narrowing of the world's horizons, the knowledge that catastrophe was possible, had also produced a specific broadening of the imagination, the willingness to ask whether things could be different, that is one of the preconditions for making them different. The Decameron. I want to return to Boccaccio because the Decameron is not only a document of the plague, but a response to it that says something important about what the survivors chose to do. The frame narrative of the Decameron is explicit. 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, from the upper classes of Florentine society, meet in the church of Santa Maria Novella and agree to leave the plague-stricken city for a fortnight, retreating to the countryside where they will tell stories to pass the time in a pleasant and disciplined way. The stories they tell are 100 tales spanning the full range of human experience. Stories of love, stories of cleverness, stories of foolishness, stories of wicked clergy, stories of generous rulers, stories of clever women, stories of faithful lovers. They are told in the aftermath of the worst catastrophe that had struck Florence in living memory, by people who have just watched their city be destroyed, who are themselves in flight from the dying. The act of storytelling in the Decameron is not escapism, though it includes pleasure. It is something more specific. It is the assertion, in the face of death, that human life contains things worth telling about, that there is enough in the ordinary range of human experience, in love and cleverness and foolishness and generosity and treachery and desire and loss and comedy and tragedy, to fill 100 stories, and that the telling of these stories is worth doing even now, especially now, when the world outside is full of the dying. The Decameron is the survivors' refusal to let the plague be the only story. This refusal is, in a specific way, the most important thing that the Black Death produced. Not the demographic changes, not the theological disruptions, not the economic transformations, though all of these were real and significant. The most important thing was the specific decision made by countless specific people in countless specific places to continue, to go on, to bury the dead and then get up and go back to work, to write the poem, build the church, paint the altarpiece, tell the story, to choose life in the specific sense that choosing life after a catastrophe requires. Not the passive continuation that biology makes inevitable, but the active choice to make something of the time that remains. Agnolo di Tura buried his 5 children with his own hands. He had lost 5 children. He was in a city where the bodies were piling up in the streets, and the graveyards were full, and the bells were ringing constantly for the dead. And he wrote about it. He wrote, "I can say what I cannot bear to remember." And then he said it anyway. This is what the survivors always do. They say what they cannot bear to remember, and in the saying of it, they give it to the future, to the people who were not there, to the people who cannot fully understand, but who need to know. They continue. The world that came after the Black Death was not better than the world that came before. The dead were dead, and they were not replaced by equivalent lives, and the specific texture of the world that had been, the specific people, and the specific relationships and the specific communities that the plague had destroyed, could not be recovered. The Europe of 1400 was not the Europe of 1340, and the gap between them was not merely the passage of time, but the world that came after was a world. It was inhabited by people who went on inhabiting it. They built things, they had children, they wrote poems, they prayed, they argued and loved and grieved and laughed. They planted the empty fields and tried to find workers for the abandoned mills, and said masses for the dead, and tried to understand what had happened and why, and whether it would happen again, and it did happen again. The plague returned in 1361, and 1369, and 1375, and in subsequent waves throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. The survivors of 1348 were not promised that they would not face it again. Most of them knew they might, and they lived their lives anyway, in the knowledge that catastrophe was possible and might be imminent, with the specific combination of grief and resilience and determination to make something of the present that is perhaps the most distinctively human response to the knowledge of mortality. The rats came first, and then the fleas, and then the bacteria that no one could name, and then the dying, in numbers that no one could have imagined, and the burying that could not keep pace with the dying, and the abandonment, and the flight, and the flagellants, and the prayers, and the massacre of the Jews, and the collapse of the church's authority, and the emptying of the fields, and the renegotiation of the labour contracts, and the writing of the Decameron. And then the world continued, diminished, transformed, in some ways unmade, but continuing. This is the history of the Black Death, not the death which was extraordinary, but the living that came after it, which was ordinary in all the ways that human life is ordinary, and extraordinary in all the ways that surviving a catastrophe is extraordinary. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me take you to the specific material world of the plague, to the objects and the spaces and the textures that the 14th century left behind, because history is most vivid when it is most material, and the Black Death has left material traces that are worth contemplating. The Plague Pit. The mass graves of the Black Death are the most physically immediate of its material traces, and they have been found at excavation sites across Europe over the past several decades. In London, the Museum of London Archaeology has excavated several plague burial sites from the 14th century, and the pattern they reveal is specific and consistent. The burials are organised, not the chaotic piling of bodies that the literary accounts suggest, but rows of individual burials laid in order, sometimes with some provision for identification. The people burying the dead in 1348 and 1349 were not simply disposing of bodies, they were, as best they could in the specific circumstances, performing the burial rites, organising the bodies, placing them properly, doing what they could to accord the dead the dignity that the tradition required. The bones themselves carry information. Forensic analysis of the skeletons from plague pits has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis DNA in the teeth of some of the buried individuals, providing a direct biological link between the 14th century burials and the disease that caused them. This analysis, first performed successfully in the early 21st century, connected the material record to the documentary record in a way that had not previously been possible, confirming what the documents said was happening by finding in the physical bodies of the dead the biological evidence of the disease that killed them. The Dance of Death. The artistic tradition of the Danse Macabre emerged in the decades after the Black Death and became one of the most distinctive artistic expressions of the late medieval period. The earliest examples are from Germany in the 1340s, and the tradition spread rapidly through France, England, the Low Countries, and the Italian city-states. The typical form shows a procession of people from all social classes: pope, emperor, cardinal, king, bishop, knight, merchant, peasant, child, each accompanied by a figure of death who leads them toward the grave. The procession is democratic. Death takes everyone, from the highest to the lowest, and the social distinctions that define life are dissolved in the common destination of death. The Danse Macabre was not merely morbid art, it was didactic and polemical. The specific insistence on death's indifference to social rank was a commentary on the social order that the plague had visibly disrupted. The plague had not respected rank. The Pope and the peasant died at comparable rates. The knight in his castle was not more protected than the serf in his hut, or not much more. The specific equality of mortality that the plague had demonstrated was the argument that the Danse Macabre illustrations made visible. This is where we are all going, together, regardless of everything we think distinguishes us from each other. The image of death in the Danse Macabre is typically a skeleton or a partially decomposed figure. The body after the plague had done its work, the body after the flesh had gone. This specific iconography of the decomposing body, the body in the process of becoming bones, was not absent from pre-plague medieval art, but it became more prominent, more detailed, more central to the visual vocabulary of the period after 1348. The memento mori tradition, the tradition of including in portraits or in devotional images some reminder of death, typically a skull or a death's head, intensified in the plague period and remained a significant element of European visual culture for centuries afterward. The Black Death in literature. The literary responses to the Black Death are diverse and not always what a modern reader would expect. The great wave of death was not immediately followed by a great wave of grief literature. The literary response was more oblique than direct, more often addressed through the frame of the story told to pass the time or the allegory of fortune's wheel than through direct elegy or lament. Boccaccio's Decameron is the most famous literary response to the Black Death, but it is, as I have noted, an oblique one. The stories themselves are not primarily about the plague. They are about love and cleverness and human folly in the general, set in the Italy of the recent past and in the fairy tale world of romance. The plague is in the frame, not in the stories, and the stories are explicitly a response to the plague, a way of recovering from it, of reasserting the value of human life and human pleasure against the specific negation that the plague represented. William Langland's Piers Plowman, written in the decades after the Black Death in England, is a more directly engaged response, a dream vision that wrestles with the specific questions that the plague had raised about the Church's authority, about the nature of salvation, about the relationship between social class and spiritual worth. Langland's poem is not a plague narrative, but it is saturated with the specific anxieties of the post-plague world, the fear of sudden death, the distrust of the institutional church, the specific concern about whether the poor and the unlettered could be saved without the mediating institutions of the church. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, begun in the 1380s, is the most fully achieved English literary response to the specific world that the Black Death created. The tales are explicitly organised around a journey to a saint's shrine, one of the specific post-plague religious practices, the pilgrimage of thanks or of petition to the saints who could protect against the plague and could heal the sick. And the pilgrims who tell the tales are a cross-section of the post-plague English social world, the knight and the prioress and the miller and the wife of Bath and the doctor and the pardoner, all of them recognisably positioned in a social world that has been reorganised by the specific economic and social consequences of the plague. The miller and the reeve and the wife of Bath are representatives of the specific social types that the post-plague world had elevated. The prosperous peasant, the economically independent woman, the skilled craftsperson with a sense of their own worth, and their presence in the tales alongside the knight and the prioress is itself a kind of documentary record of what the plague had done to the social hierarchy. The medical response, the specific inadequacy of medieval medicine in the face of the Black Death, is well documented, and I want to give it more attention than I have, because the failure of the medical tradition in 1347 and 1348 and 1349 was not the failure of incompetent or lazy people. It was the failure of a medical tradition that was, by the standards of its own framework, quite sophisticated, that had inherited the Greek and Islamic medical traditions, that had the works of Galen and Avicenna and Hippocrates as its foundational texts, that was practiced by trained physicians who had spent years learning their craft. The medical faculty of the University of Paris issued a report in 1348 explaining the causes of the plague. The report attributed the disease to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius in 1345, an astrological event that had corrupted the upper atmosphere. The warm, moist south winds had then carried this corrupted air northward and westward, producing the putrid exhalations in the earth and the water that caused the disease. The report recommended avoiding the south winds, avoiding large fish and meat that might intensify the putrid humours, eating garlic and rosemary, washing the body in vinegar, and not sleeping during the day. This is not the advice of foolish or ignorant people. It is the advice of learned people, working within a sophisticated medical framework. The Galenic humoral theory, the miasma theory, the astrological medicine that had been developed by Islamic astronomers and physicians. They were wrong about the mechanism, but they were not wrong because they were stupid. They were wrong because the correct explanation, bacteria transmitted by fleas carried by rats, was genuinely outside the conceptual framework of medieval medicine, outside the observational tools available to medieval science, outside anything that any medical tradition in the world had yet worked out. The specific failure of medieval medicine to understand the Black Death had a long-term consequence that was, in a paradoxical way, positive. It demonstrated clearly, in the most visible possible way, that the existing medical tradition was inadequate. The plague that killed perhaps a third of the population of Europe, while the most learned physicians of the continent stood by, unable to explain or prevent or treat it, was a specific demonstration that more and better knowledge was needed. The development of European medicine in the 15th and 16th centuries, the anatomical revolution of Vesalius, the development of a more empirical approach to clinical observation, the growing skepticism about the authority of Galen, was not caused by the Black Death. but it drew in part on the specific awareness that the Black Death had created. The awareness that the tradition was insufficient, that more was needed, that the gap between what medicine knew and what medicine needed to know was a gap that had allowed a third of Europe to die, the orphans. One of the specific human consequences of the Black Death that does not receive as much attention as it deserves is the production of orphans, children whose parents had died of the plague, who were suddenly without the specific structure of family care and provision that constituted the child's primary relationship to the social world. The orphan's position in the medieval world was precarious. The specific institutions for caring for orphaned children, the orphanages that some cities had established, the church charitable provision for the poor, the informal networks of family and neighborhood care, were all under extreme stress during and after the plague. The specific situation of the orphaned child in the plague year is one of the most difficult to contemplate. The child who was old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to fend for themselves, who had watched their parents die, who was now alone in the house with the bodies. This is a figure who appears occasionally in the sources, in the accounts of houses where the dying were found alongside the dead, of children discovered with their dead parents, who had to be removed and placed in the care of whoever would take them. The children who survived this, who were orphaned by the plague and who went on to live, to grow up, to have children of their own, to pass on whatever they carried from the experience, are mostly invisible to us. They left no record of their experience because they were children and because the record-keeping of the period did not attend to children in the way that it attended to property and clerical appointments. But they were there, in the post-plague world, carrying the specific experience of having lost everything at an age when the loss was most absolute and least comprehensible. The Black Death and the consolidation of national languages. One of the indirect consequences of the Black Death that is easy to overlook in the focus on mortality and theology is the specific acceleration of the use of vernacular languages, French, English, Italian, German, Spanish, in literature and in intellectual life that the post-plague period showed. The plague had disrupted the clerical Latin tradition by killing many of the clergy who were its primary practitioners and transmitters. The replacement clergy, who were hastily ordained to fill the gap, were often less well trained in Latin and more comfortable with the vernacular. But the shift to the vernacular was also driven by the specific communication needs of the plague period. You needed to explain what was happening to people who did not read Latin, who had never learnt Latin, who had no access to the clerical culture that used Latin as its primary medium. You needed to comfort people who were dying and who could only be comforted in their own language. You needed to issue public health instructions, to organise public responses, to record what was happening in terms that the ordinary population could understand. The literary masterworks of the post-plague generation, Boccaccio and Chaucer writing in their vernaculars, Petrarch writing in Italian as well as Latin, were part of this shift, and the shift accelerated the development of the literary languages that would become the national languages of early modern Europe. The specific conditions of the Black Death contributed, in a roundabout way, to the linguistic diversity of the modern world, the survivor's world. I want to give you a final image of what the post-plague world looked like for the people who lived in it. Not the great catastrophe, not the masses of the dead, but the specific ordinary world that the survivors inhabited when the worst was over. It is sometime in the early 1350s. The plague has passed through, its worst fury spent. The surviving population of a village in the Po Valley, or the English Midlands, or the French countryside, is going back to the work of daily life. The fields need to be planted, the animals need to be tended, the mill needs to be repaired, the church needs to be maintained. The ordinary business of survival in a pre-industrial agricultural economy needs to go on. Because if it does not go on, the people who survived the plague will not survive the winter. But the world they are doing this work in is different from the world before the plague. Some of the fields belong to no one now, because everyone who had a claim to them is dead, and the lord who might have reasserted his claim died too. Some of the houses are empty, waiting for new tenants, or for the weeds to take them over, whichever comes first. The prices in the market town are different. Wool is cheaper because the production is down, but the wages for shearing and spinning are higher because there are fewer people to do the work. The priest in the church is younger than the priest who was there before, and perhaps less learned, and he conducts the services with a slight uncertainty that reflects his awareness that he is doing something he is not quite fully prepared for. And the people themselves are different. They know something that their parents and grandparents did not know in the same embodied, personal way. They know that the world can be catastrophically disrupted, that the specific people and the specific places that organize one's life can be suddenly and permanently absent, that the social order is contingent and not permanent. This knowledge is not comfortable. It is not a knowledge that produces optimism or complacency, but it is a knowledge that produces a specific quality of attention to the present, a specific awareness of what is there and what is not, a specific valuing of what remains. Agnolo di Tura, Christine de Pisan, Petrarch, writing after Laura, the 10 young people of the Decameron, telling their stories in the garden. The plague doctor in his beaked mask, doing the inadequate thing that is all he has to do. The English bishop, authorizing lay confession because there are no priests left. William Mompesson, burying his wife in the field outside the quarantined village. These are the people of the Black Death, not the dead, who cannot speak. The survivors, who do. They buried their dead with their own hands, and they continued. The world did not end with the Black Death, though it must have felt, in the winter of 1348, as if it might. The world continued, because worlds continue even when they should not, even when the scale of the loss seems to preclude continuation. The specific lives of the survivors were different from what they would have been, shaped by the absence of the people who were gone, organized around the empty spaces in the landscape and the community, conducted in the awareness that this had happened once and could happen again, but they were lives, fully human, specific, individual, mortal lives, lived in the shadow of the plague, yes, and in the shadow of the memory of the plague, and in the shadow of the knowledge that the plague could return, but lived. The fields were planted, the children were born, the stories were told, the songs were sung, the churches were built and painted and prayed in. This is what the survivors did. They went on being human, and that is in the end the most remarkable thing about the Black Death. Not that it killed so many, but that the ones it did not kill continued to be everything that makes us human, including the capacity to bury our dead and then, somehow, go on. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.